Hi, everyone. If you checked out a sensory bag, just make sure you return it to check-in, and you can check it out again tomorrow, and I will hand it over to Dr. Crespo.
All right. So it is a pleasure for me to introduce you a good friend of mine, Dr. Hector Alvarez from the Oregon Health Science University School of Nursing. He is the Senior Associate Dean for Research, comes to us from the University of Texas, El Paso. He has a degree in civil engineering and environmental science. He also has a graduate certificate in epidemiology, so he'll know what he's talking about. His main area of research, and I know some of you have brought up climate change, sustainability. He's been working with the interaction between the natural, the built, and the social environment, and psychosocial stress and responses by the immune system. And he's got a long, lengthy line of research and articles. And he is also a member of the board of directors for the Oregon Latino Health Coalition. And I have the pleasure to work with him in a variety of projects. I'm really excited to introduce you to Hector.
Well, that was almost accurate, except the part that I know what I'm talking about. So as Carlos said, I consider myself a scientist, although I was trained as an engineer, and specifically I was trained as an exposure scientist. I do now health sciences, and at the very core, I'm very interested in the totality of the environment and how it affects behavior and how it affects health and health disparity. However, there's not going to be any slides because I'm not going to show you any of my research. And I hope by the end of this talk, it will make sense why I did not do that. I have a very tall agenda today. I want to talk to you about health disparity. I do want to talk to you about the importance of research, science, technology in helping resolve that problem and other important social problems that we're facing right now in the US and in the world in general. But what I want to do is to help us or intrigue you enough to look at those problems from a very different perspective. I want us to consider what the role of human nature plays in generating these problems. And the reason I want to do that is because those of us that are interested in science ultimately go into this field with the objective of using science and technology and engineering to solve these problems. And that was exactly what drove me to move from engineering into health science, because I wanted to help solve, keyword, solve these problems. And after a lot of years in this field, I have come to the conclusion that the way that we're framing the problems is wrong. And as an engineer, I know that if the problem is not framed properly, the odds of solving it are close to zero. So I think at the very core of the problems that we're interested in solving for ourselves, for our kids, for our grandkids, we need to frame them properly. To do that, I'm going to start to talk to you about stress. I'm talking about the stress that we feel when we are fearful, when we are worried, when we are discriminated, the type of thing that generates cortisol. I'm going to go all the way back, and I'm going to try to give you a sort of cartoonish but scientifically accurate, I hope, not comprehensive, idea of where stress came from, why it's so important to us, and why it still dictates a lot of our individual and collective behavior. And I think from there, we're going to be able to explore other problems more in a more interesting way. So from a biological perspective, we could argue that the purpose of life is to replicate our DNA. For humans, that means having babies. If that is true, from an evolutionary perspective, evolution would be this sort of laboratory through which nature has been testing personal traits to see which ones increase our capacity to replicate our DNA. And those personal traits that increase that capacity stay in the gene pool and they become part of evolution. And those traits that through genetic mutation decrease our ability to pass down our genes, they get washed out of the evolutionary process. Very simple. Now, from that perspective, other traits that indirectly might increase our capacity to have babies would also stay in the gene pool. And one of them, one that is even older than humanity itself, is stress. And the reason that I say it's older is because the ability to deal with stress, and I'll define it more comprehensively right now, it exists before humans existed. I mean, we share this process with reptiles and every animal in between. It's at the very core of our brain, that process. Now, the reason that this stress mechanism is so important to life in general is that those species that do not have a stress response will not subsist. They actually will die. Life cannot exist without it. And let me tell you why. Stress, in a very broad way, it's the set of traits that increases our capacity to survive a life-threatening event. I'm going to repeat this. Stress, from an evolutionary perspective, the main reason it exists is because it increases our capacity to survive a life-threatening event. The way it does this is very interesting. It's like twofold. Well, let me explain first. Stress is actually two things first. Two set of processes. The first one is vigilance. And the second one is reactivity. And reactivity is what probably most of you recognize as stress. The first part, vigilant, is actually the surveillance of our environment in its totality in the search for threats. That's how it evolved. That's how it happened. So humans, for instance, we spend pretty much our entire day, 24/7, even when we're asleep, scanning our environment. Our subconscious is doing that. That's why a noise in the night will wake us up, because we're always scanning the environment, right? And once we identify something that we perceive as a life-threatening event or a stressor, then we react. And that's where reactivity comes in. Now, I'm going to emphasize something here. The stressor, the life-threatening, is something that we perceive as threatening. Keyword perceive. So there's subjectiveness here. So what you might consider threatening, I don't consider threatening, depending on our life experience, right? Now, reactivity. So once we identify something that is, in fact, perceived as life-threatening, then our body has this awesome set of mechanisms that prime us to increase our capacity to survive such a threat. One way that it does that is by priming our body and our mind to do two key behaviors. One, run away, and the other one, to fight. Everybody has heard flight or fight, right? The way that it does this physiologically is that, it primes our body to do one of those things. The way it does that is that, our heart rate goes up, our blood starts pumping, oxygen gets into our muscles, because that's where we're going to need them to fight, or flight. Now, psychologically, it also primes us to both. And the way that it does this, stress actually comes from the part of our brain where fear and anger live, where fear and anger are processed. And fear and anger are actually the opposite sides of the same coin. That's where they're processed in the same place, the exact same place that we see that lights up when we're stressed. And this is very, very important, because human behavior, the way that it happens is we're motivated by emotions. Emotions helps us either approach something or avoid something, right? So for instance, if we're hungry, we approach food, we go and look for food. If we were never hungry, we would never look for it, right? Cognitively, we never would convince ourselves, hey, let's go hunting or let's do something else. If we don't feel hungry, we would not look for food. Just to give you an example. So fear motivates avoidance, which is what motivates the flight, right? So we have to be fearful. We avoid things we're fearful. And the more fearful we are of something, the faster we avoid them. Fear is necessary for that flight response. Now, anger, what do you think is necessary for? The fight. So anger mediates the behavior of violence. Also necessary, also very human. We wouldn't be here without these processes. Very human. So it mediates that. So violence, when we're threatened, is the response. It's a very adaptive response from an evolutionary perspective. Now, the other thing that happens here is how we assess those threats. Let's go back to that a little. Wait a minute. I skipped something. There's one more thing that stress that's physiologically. And this is prepared us in the case we get wounded. Let's say we do engage in a fight and we win, we survive, but we end up wounded. For humans, for instance, the number one cause of mortality across evolutionary time has been infections. And we have evolved to anticipate infections when we're stressed. Because we might get into a fight, we might end up wounded, and we need to close the wounds. Infection, if you ever been wounded, the inflammation around your wound actually closes the wound so that it decreases exposure to bacteria and virus and reduces your possibility of dying out of an infection. So it prepares us to run, it prepares us to fight, and it prepares our body in the case we get wounded with inflammation. Now, the other thing that has happened that it's associated with stress is that we have now associated certain social actions to stress as well. The reason we did this is because as we were evolving, those ancestors that had the capacity, the trait to socialize and group, that group increased the survivability of themselves, and therefore the odds that their genes would get replicated. So our ancestors, those that were able to group because they had social skills and social abilities, were able to survive better, right? Now, the problem when we started to group with each other was that other versions of us also started to group with each other. So now there was a whole bunch of us in groups. And now there was the possibility for us to start fighting over resources. And it turns out that the group, of course, the one that was more intelligent or more capable or more strategic had the odds of surviving and their genes being passed down. But also the ones that were more violent. They also had the opportunity to survive and their genes to be passed down. Another thing, when we're stressed, especially when we're in those social groups, it became very, very important, very adaptive to quickly identify who is an us and who is a them. Now that we were in groups, there was the possibility that I might fall behind and I was left behind in the jungle. And suddenly I hear, others coming. I needed to know quickly if those others were an us or it was a them. Why? Because if I fail, I could die. So this ability to do that fast, very adaptive. Now there's a problem, right? We need to do that fast. And our brain is this pattern-making machine. Our brain has two ways of thinking. And the one that it prefers, especially when it's threatened, when it's fearful, it's a pattern-based approach to thinking. Let me give you an example. So let's say, my uncle was eaten by a lion, my mother, was eaten by a lion, my father was eaten by a lion, and now I'm walking in the jungle and now I see a lion, right? So I can engage two different processes to decide what I should do. One, the pattern-making one. Lion, threat, I'm out of here, right? The other one is, wait a minute, not every lion is a human-eating lion. Maybe I should approach the lion and give the lion a chance to see, right? Maybe it's not that dangerous. Those are the two options, the logical one, right? Now, the problem with that is that both of them, we could be wrong, right? The first one, it turns out that the lion was actually a nice lion, and we thought it was dangerous, and we ran. The mistake was that it wasn't. We discriminated the lion, right? We jump into conclusions, right? We were prejudiced against the lion, poor lion. But the result is we're alive. The other option, where we're nicer to the lion and we're more logical, that leads to death. And those genes do not get passed down, less likely. The point I'm trying to make is that all of you and all of us, and me included, we are the descendants of people that jump into conclusions. We are the descendants of people that, use stereotypes, especially when they're under pressure, to assess who's dangerous and who's not. We are all the descendants of people that use a pattern-based approach to decide who's them and who's us. And without that mechanism, none of us would be here today. It's just a fact. Human nature. All of us. You cannot even fight it. It's in every gene, in every cell of everyone present here today. It's not optional. Now, you might argue, wait a minute, but, we can think, right? Yeah, we can think, but not when we're stressed. Not when we're stressed, not when we're threatened. Our mind just goes that direction. It just goes that direction. The other thing that happened when we were in groups is that, I'm sorry, I need to make sure that I'm not falling behind. The other thing that happened when we were in groups is that not being part of the group became very stressful. Right? So being isolated, I told you, if you were part of the group and suddenly you find yourself away from the group, very stressful. I don't know if you ever got lost when I was little. I did it often. And even though I was surrounded by people, all strangers, I was incredibly frightened to not see my mom. Because all these people were them. They were not an us. And that's incredibly stressful. And a child that even doesn't have all the cognitive ability to figure out why that's dangerous or not, innately acts like if that's a very dangerous circumstance. Think about it. It's in our genes, right? So therefore, social rejection, which leads to isolation, is also very stressful because it's associated with that. The other thing, the other social factor, status, social status. Our ancestors, if you were the alpha, in non-human primates, if you were the alpha, you had access to resources, you were the most attractive, you were the most likely to mate. Right? Your family was the most likely to survive. The opposite, if you were the omega, you were the last one to eat, if there was anything left. And your family was the last one to eat. So imagine how many people wanted to mate with you. Not many. So we evolved to be conscious of social status. It was a survival mechanism, very important, still in apes. Go to the primate center. You can see this still happen there. Actually, just go to Facebook and you see this happens. Very important. That's why we all evolved to be obsessed where we are socially. Obsessed. Because going down in the social status, no matter how we define it, how beautiful you are, how tall, how fast, how strong, how rich, it doesn't matter. We all define it some way. And if we go down, it's stressful. That's why we're obsessed with comparison, and that's why we're obsessed with going up. In reality or by pretending. Both of them work, by the way. We're obsessed. There's a reason for that. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because this way of thinking actually explains a lot about health and health disparities. So it turns out that we evolved in that environment, and all these mechanisms were very adaptive for that environment. But something very odd happened to us. We changed our environment drastically. We pulled the environmental rug under us. Let me give you some reference. So humans, we started to deviate from non-human primates 14 million years ago. The first 10 millions, we don't count those species as human, but the deviation had started. Humans, we started to call species humans 3.6 million years ago. Let's round that at 4. 4 million years ago, we started to call that new lineage human. Us, Homo sapiens, this version of us, 40,000 years have existed. 40,000 years. Now, current society, the way we know it with money and exchanges, Okay, 40,000 years, modern society, and I mean, changing in 10,000 years. That's how long agriculture has been around. 10,000 years. And now if you think, modern society, cars and planes, 200 years. That's the Industrial Revolution. Our capacity to know what everybody's eating 24/7, our capacity to be exposed to fear and threat constantly, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, this happened. 10 years ago. And we're talking millions of years of evolution in our genes. And we judge ourselves like if everything we do is cognitively driven. It's very limited. The capacity to control our behavior. I know that we're all very us-centered, and we like to think that humans is the coolest thing, since, Coke or whatever. It's not. It's not. We're not that detached from our ancestors. And we have very limited willpower. Science shows that. Very limited willpower. It's very limited. And it's, by the way, stress diminishes away. And we don't every time we try to talk about solving a problem, we never talk about this, right? I mean, we want to talk about racism. We want to talk about social inequality. We want to talk about all these big problems, and we never want to say and talk about the role that human nature plays in all of these problems and how limited we are. And here's the biggest problem, right? That we want to solve this as if it was a cognitive problem. We have the social determinants of health. We have all these things that cause health disparities and other problems. And for some reason, we're obsessed to think we're going to think ourselves out of this, right? We need more technology. Obviously, that's not helping, right? We're going to come up with a very awesome policy. That's not helping. And the reason it's not helping is because we don't have the proper framing for our problems. So let me tell you, I was asked to talk to you about the social determinants of health. So let me list them at least, right? So the social determinants of health are economic instability, social environment, physical environment, access and quality to education, and access and quality to healthcare. These are very useful. Very useful. Why? Because they help us identify quickly who might be in a vulnerable circumstance. Very useful. If you work at a hospital, for instance, you can measure this quickly, and you can help people get access to resources and do something like that. So very useful. The other thing that they're useful for, policy interventions, right? I mean, we can argue, we can send letters and call our representative and beg for policy that increases minimum salaries, that more people have the possibility of economic stability, not wealth. Economic stability. That means having enough, to pay the rent, having enough to buy the groceries, having enough to send the child to school. Just that's what we mean. There's policy, we can increase access to healthcare, we can do better education. But let me ask you this, and again, all of you, right, that are interested in science, I hope that you become interested in these problems and you try to solve them. But let me ask you something. Is it really possible for health equity to exist in a world where wealth disparity also exists? It can't. It's impossible. Impossible. Think about it. Every policy, there's always going to be somebody higher up with more resources, and they're always going to invest them in all these other things. And there's nothing we can do. So at best, science and technology, I'm an engineer and I'm a scientist, and I love what I do. And I encourage you all to do it, but it's limited. It's limited because we're not framing the problem properly. So let me ask you, if I walked out of my house, an hour ago when I left, and I get into my car, and I sit looking backwards, and I start to drive like this, what are the odds that I end up here? Almost zero, right? I'm going to probably crash at the first corner. Well, that's exactly where society is right now. That's where we're at. We all want a future where it's not full of fear, where we're not afraid to send our children to their school, right? We all want that. We all want a world where there's no them. There's only us. But how are we going to generate that world if we keep embracing an environment of fear and threat? Impossible. It's impossible. It's not a cognitive challenge. I mean, how do we do it? How do we trick ourselves? Human nature will win. As long as the environment remains threatening for most of us, all of us, violence and anger will be the predominant emotion and behavior. It's just a fact. So in order to move forward, in order to get there, the first thing we need to do is sacrifice the past. Yeah, we can have it in our rearview mirror so that we don't forget, so that it doesn't happen again. But it cannot be our purpose of living. It cannot be. It has to be the future. And I know that I'm talking about very serious things here that we need to overlook and leave behind. But this obsession with justice is taken away from the possibility of having the future that we want. The only way we're going to get there is if we sacrifice this obsession with retribution for what has happened. And even if it happened, it wouldn't solve the problem. It just wouldn't. What I'm getting to is that we are going to have to forgive. And there's no other way. This is, at least again, this is why I went through embrace the whole human nature thing, to sort of convince you that genetically we're incapable of doing that. The only way we have a chance is if we create a safer, kinder environment. We need to stop looking at the back at the past, and that means we need to forgive. And the main reason I went through all the trouble and drag you through the whole story of stress and convince you that violence and anger are the result of a threatening environment is to help you frame the way that you see the world right now in a very different way. First, we're all human, and we have more in common than we are different, including this tendency to think that way. The other is that I want you to realize that understanding is going to be the key, that we need to be more tolerant. I mean, right now we live in a society that is hypersensitive, and we feel entitled to be hypersensitive. God forbid somebody uses the wrong word to refer to Latinos, because, it's a problem. I think we're putting our anger and our attention in the wrong place. I'm not undermining all these things. They are important. But that future is way more important than anything else. I have a daughter, and I want her to live and grow up in a better place. I want her to have children and not worry every damn night, again, if they're safe out there. I'm going to tell you one story to finish up. So when my daughter, she was potty training, she wetted her bed a couple times. And the last time she did that, Mommy and I went into her room, and Mommy starts to clean up the bed. And she approaches me with her face full of sadness, guilt, and embarrassment. And she looks at me and says, "Daddy, I'm sorry. Do you forgive me?" I have reflected my entire life on that moment since then. Because what I found out that day is, first of all, there was nothing to forgive. Nothing. I mean, there were some adverse outcomes, right? There was a wet bed, there was a stained mattress. But it's a 2-year-old being potty trained. It's expected. This behavior is expected. And there's nothing to be offended when the behavior is expected. And when I don't get offended because I understand where the behavior comes from, there's no need for forgiveness. Now I know that the problems that we face in society are way bigger than a wet blanket and a stained mattress. But we're going to have to find a way. We're going to have to find a way to see all of us as us and to really digest our entire human behavior from that perspective. If we keep obsessed with deciding what was right and what is wrong instead of what's logical and natural, we're never going to get there. So, you're all here, you're all getting educated, you're going to be awesome scientists, researchers, engineers, and all the other cool things you're going to do. And I hope that that education helps you do well in life, very well. But I'm going to urge you to also do good. Use what you learned to do good. And I hope that you take the message that I give you today to see yourselves and the people around you in a very different light. Thank you.
What about another round of applause to Dr. Hector Alvarez Alvarez? Oh, well, so we are coming to the end of day one, and we will be here tomorrow, and we'll have another party for tomorrow and on Wednesday.
I was just going to say, we have some extra food at the back, so if you'd like to take some home, please do. That's all.
Literally, please take whatever you want. There's food that we're just going to have to bring to the office. So take plates. I packaged some stuff up. Take a tray. Take the sauces. Thank you.
We don't want to have a food fight.